Hey everyone, so what is a fiat currency and how does it get debased? So a fiat currency is a currency that is made up by fiat, and by fiat means by dictate or by decree or basically made up out of thin air. So the world currently runs on fiat currencies, which means currencies that are backed by nothing other than the declaration by a nation state that the currency has value. This has not always been the case, and in fact, fiat currencies virtually never arise from on their own. They never start as a fiat currency, and the reason for that is because nobody is dumb enough to believe that a piece of paper has 100 times as much value if it has the number 100 printed on it as compared to if it has the number 1 printed on it. So it's essentially impossible to start a fiat currency from scratch, and because nobody's dumb enough to fall for that. So the way currencies always start is not as fiat currencies. They always start as currencies that are pegged to something, either to a commodity that is scarce, like gold or silver, or to another currency that is pegged to a scarce commodity, or at least a major currency that has value based on the size of the economy that it is used in. So if you go back prior to World War II, the currencies of the world were built on gold or silver almost entirely. So again, you can't really have a fiat currency that comes out of nowhere because nobody would trust it. So they would say, okay, this dollar represents 1/20th of an ounce of gold in the case of the United States. So a gold was valued at $20 per ounce, which means each dollar was worth 1/20th of an ounce of gold. So that was not a fiat currency. That was a gold-backed currency. And so that is the way it always starts. Now, because gold is very slow to move around and it's not very divisible, and it has poor monetary properties in a lot of cases. It is relatively scarce, not as scarce as Bitcoin, but relatively scarce. But its other monetary properties are deficient, and so people use paper instead of gold. And so a dollar was supposed to represent 1/20th of an ounce of gold. And actually, if you look on, for example, a $10 bill, it would say one redeemable for $1 or $10 of gold. And then later they changed the words on it to redeemable for $10, and then they ultimately changed it to just $10 because you couldn't actually redeem that paper for anything. It was just a piece of paper that you could use to pay your taxes or whatever. So to recap here, fiat currencies are made-up currencies that have value entirely by fiat, which is by decree or by dictate or by declaration of an entity, typically a central government of some sort. And they don't start that way. They start by being anchored to gold or silver or some other currency that is perceived to be stable or valuable, like the US dollar. And then 100% of the time, whoever controls that currency prints too much of it, and then ultimately it is debased. So what does debased mean? Well, every currency had a base metal. The reason it's called debased was because it had a base metal of gold or silver. So when you debase a currency, you are saying, okay, this 1 ounce gold coin is made of 1 ounce of silver. Well, if that gold coin ends up being only having 0.9 ounces of silver in it, and then 0.1 ounce of some junk metal that's cheap, that is debasing the currency because the base of gold has started to be replaced and diluted with some other junk metal. So all currencies started by gold or silver backing at 100%, and then they would slowly get debased down to 95%, 92%, 84%, ultimately until the metal inside them went to effectively zero, where just like in the U.S., in the case of the U.S., the actual metal inside a quarter or a nickel or a dime is barely worth anything because they don't even use valuable metals for that. For example, a quarter used to have silver in it, but then of course they debased the quarter, and now the quarter does not even have a quarter's worth of silver in it. And if you get a really old quarter that is still made of silver, it's worth way more than 25 cents because it has not been debased if you find one that comes from far enough in the past. So a fiat currency is a made-up currency. Made-up currencies never start that way because nobody would believe in them. And they get debased when whoever controls the representation of that currency, like the physical piece of paper of the US dollar or whatever it is, when they print too much of it as compared to what was supposed to be backing it. So the US dollar used to be backed by gold. The British pound used to be backed by silver. All of them were backed ultimately by fallible, sinful humans who ultimately printed too much money and ultimately came off of the standard, and they debased the currency. And now you cannot redeem the fiat currency of the world. You cannot redeem them for anything valuable. They're just made up money. So now and then when a currency hyperinflates, meaning it becomes almost worthless, and you find, dollar bills just, in the gutter on the road because nobody considers it worthwhile to lean down and pick them up. So what a country will try to do is re-anchor the currency to some sort of a precious metal peg, or in the future, likely a Bitcoin, some sort of a Bitcoin peg. So, for example, Zimbabwe tried this. So Zimbabwe has had a huge problem with hyperinflation of their currency. And so they introduced a gold-backed, a ZIG, a Zimbabwe, capital Z, lowercase I, capital G, Zimbabwe gold-backed. The G stands for gold, the ZI stands for Zimbabwe. They introduced a gold-backed currency, 6 months ago or whenever it was, with the promise being that, hey, we debased the other currency, and that's why you can still get a $100 trillion bill from the old Zimbabwe currency. It got so inflated that you needed a $100 trillion bill to buy anything. And then ultimately they retired the currency entirely because it was so worthless. But anyway, so they introduced a gold-backed currency. And of course that lasted, 6 months. And they claimed it was backed by the full faith and credit of Zimbabwe and by gold. But of course it wasn't, because it never actually is. And so they printed way too much of it. And so last week they devalued the gold-backed currency by 40%. Now, if it were actually backed by gold, that would be impossible to do, because if you claimed it was worth 40% less, everybody would just go turn it in for the gold. Well, obviously you're not allowed to do that, so it's not really backed by gold. And when they devalue it, they say, hey, this is, instead of being backed by an ounce of gold, it's actually only backed by 0.6 ounces of gold. And of course, everybody knows that if it's only backed by 0.6 ounces of gold, then tomorrow it's going to be only backed by 0.4, and then it'll be 0.2, 0.1, 0.0, and it'll just go to zero, and it won't be backed by gold at all, which happens to all fiat currencies eventually. So the same thing is happening to the US dollar. The US dollar has lost somewhere between 97 and 98% of its value since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. And all the other fiat currencies are doing the same thing. So after World War II, the US government convinced all of the other countries to peg their currencies to the US dollar with the promise that the US dollar would be pegged to gold, and that way all of the currencies would be pegged to gold through the US dollar. Of course, the United States cheated the system, rug pulled everybody, and in 1971 told all the countries, you are not getting your gold, and the currency is not actually backed by gold after all, and you've been had. And that's what happened. So a fiat currency is a made-up currency. They never start that way. They always start by being anchored to something valuable. And then they print too much of whatever it is. And then it's not backed by the valuable thing anymore. And then eventually it's backed by nothing. And then eventually it hyperinflates and it goes away. And it's, along comes some other currency that is younger and newer and still closer to the point at which it was actually backed by something valuable. And then the same thing happens over and over and over. So the good news is that cannot happen to Bitcoin. There is no way to print more than 21 million Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. There's no way to make more of them. And and I'll cover in the next video on why that doesn't matter and why 21 million is plenty, why you don't ever need more than 21 million. I'll cover on the next video. But the short take is, Bitcoin settles instantly and is an electronic, infinitely divisible currency. So there's no reason to ever have something other than Bitcoin represent itself. There's no reason to put a paper currency on top of Bitcoin, for example, the way fiat currencies work. There's just no reason to ever do that. And because of that, there will never need to be a reason to have something other than Bitcoin represent Bitcoin. And therefore, there will not be something you can inflate and hyperinflate away and debase, because you can't do that to Bitcoin, and there's no reason to put a layer on top of Bitcoin other than Bitcoin itself, like the Lightning Network, which is the real Bitcoin. So anyway, Bitcoin is the real innovation that stops the insanity. It enables us to use a provably scarce asset that's even more scarce than gold, and it can't be debased, and there's no reason to build a paper system on top of it that supposedly represents it that then can be debased and inflated away, because Bitcoin does not have the issues related to gold, and therefore there's no reason to build a paper system on top of it like there was with gold. So that is where we are in the world, and I believe all fiat currencies will eventually go to zero, and the only thing left standing will be Bitcoin and a few people standing around holding gold, really wishing it had gone the route of gold instead of Bitcoin. But I am just certain it will go the route of Bitcoin rather than gold, for all the reasons I've covered in other videos for why gold is deficient and is not a suitable, scarce media for a digital age. It worked fine in a physical age, an analog age, an age before digital communication, but gold just does not work in a digital age. Bitcoin does. So that's fiat currency. That's debasement. Last thing I'll say is sound money. Sound money means money that is solid. It is backed by something. And the word sound comes from the fact that a gold coin makes a specific sound. So if you have a coin that is made out of fool's gold, it sounds different when you drop it than a coin made out of gold. So sound money was money that sounded like something scarce, like gold, because it was hard to make that noise with any other metal. And that's one of the way people determined if a coin was actually gold. Now, the challenge is sound money does not tell you it's 100% gold. It just tells you that the whole thing is not faked. But the problem, of course, is how do you tell the difference between a coin that is 99% gold and 100% gold when the sound is, 99% versus 100? That becomes almost impossible for humans to ascertain. It may be easy to tell if a gold coin is 100% gold or no gold at all by the sound of it when you drop it on a table, but that is not true for small variations, which matter a lot. So that is where sound money came from. Is unsound money was money that, you drop it on a table and it's clearly not gold, it's clearly worthless, it's clearly a fake. Sound money was actually provably scarce money that, made the right sound when you dropped it, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the highlights for what is fiat currency, what is debasing the currency, and what is sound money. Have a great evening.